Somewhere in the hills of Japan, right now, in the same July heat that is scorching the hostas in your yard, there is a hosta growing wild on a shaded slope. Nobody waters it, nobody feeds it, nobody kneels down to pick the slugs off it, or frets over its color, and yet it is flawless. Broad, cool, blue-green leaves standing tall in the very weather that has your prized hostas wilting by 4 in the afternoon. Now here is the part that should stop you. That wild hosta is not a tougher plant than yours. In many cases, it is the very same species, the ancestor of the cultivars sitting in your flower beds. Same plant, same heat. One is thriving all on its own, and one is depending on you for its life. For most gardeners, that difference stays a mystery their whole lives. They assume the wild one is just lucky, or hardier, or growing in some kind of magic dirt. So every July they double down. More water, more fertilizer, a new spray, a shadier corner, chasing a plant that keeps slipping through their fingers. But that wild hosta is not doing a single thing you cannot do. It simply never lost the one thing your garden hostas lost, the day they were dug up and sold. And once you see what that one thing is, you will never look at a struggling hosta the same way again. Because it quietly overturns almost everything you have been told about keeping these plants alive in the heat of summer. A hosta is not a flower. I know it lives in your flower bed, but that is an accident of the garden center, not the plant's own nature. A hosta is a creature of the forest floor. Its home, for millions of years, was the shaded ground beneath the trees in the woodlands of Japan, China, and Korea. The cool, dim, damp understory, where the leaves fall every autumn and quietly rot down into a deep, spongy blanket. That blanket is the whole secret. On a forest floor, the soil is never bare. It is covered, year after year, in a thick layer of decaying leaves. That layer holds water like a sponge through the driest weeks. It keeps the ground beneath it cool, while the air above is baking, and it feeds a whole hidden world of fungi and worms and tiny life that, in turn, feed the plant. The forest floor waters itself. It cools itself. It feeds itself. A wild hosta never needs rescuing, because it never lost its home. And here is why none of this was ever your fault. When you bought your hosta, the nursery sold you the plant, but nobody sold you its forest floor, because you cannot bottle a forest floor. You cannot patent a pile of last autumn's leaves. You cannot sell it back to a gardener every single spring. There is no money in it, so there is no marketing behind it, so nobody ever thought to mention it. They sold you the plant, and quietly forgot to hand over the ground it was built to live in. So we set these woodland plants into open, bare, exposed beds, and then we spend every July trying to hand carry the forest floor to them, one bucket of water and one bag of fertilizer at a time. The thing your hosta needs right now is not more water. It is not more food. It is its forest floor back. And in the heat of July, rebuilding that floor is the whole difference between a plant that struggles and a plant that sails. Now, most people believe a wilting hosta in July is simply a thirsty hosta. Reach for the hose, give it a drink, problem solved. And sometimes water does help. But if watering were really the whole answer, you would not see so many careful gardeners watering faithfully and still watching their hostas flag and brown in the afternoon. Here is what is actually happening down at the roots, and almost nobody talks about it. In July, the real enemy of a hosta is not dryness, it is heat, and specifically, the heat in the top few inches of soil, right where the roots live. A hosta root is a cool weather root. It comes from that shaded forest floor where the ground stays cool even on a warm day. When the soil around those roots climbs past what they are built for, the plant starts to shut down. The leaves wilt, the edges crisp, the whole plant looks like it is gasping. Not because there is no water, but because the roots are simply too hot to do their job. This is why you can water a hosta every single evening and still watch it suffer. You are pouring water onto the problem, but the problem was never only thirst. It was a warm, exposed root zone with nothing on top to shield it. On the forest floor, that blanket of leaves keeps the roots cool through the worst of the day. In your bare bed, or under a thin scattering of bark, the sun beats down on the soil all afternoon, and the roots cook. So the real question in July is not how much am I watering, it is how cool am I keeping the ground. Get the temperature of the soil right, and half the watering troubles you have been fighting for years will quietly disappear. And the way you get it right is the same way the forest has always done it. The single most powerful thing you can give a hosta in summer is the one thing the forest gives it for free. A blanket of decaying leaves. Gardeners call the finished version leaf mold, and it is nothing more than autumn leaves, piled up and left to break down into a dark, crumbly, sweet-smelling material that looks and feels like the floor of the woods. Because that is exactly what it is. Let me tell you why this beats a bag of almost anything. The Royal Horticultural Society, the Great British Gardening Authority, calls leaf mold an invaluable free soil conditioner and treats it as one of the finest mulches there is. It does not so much feed the plant as rebuild the plant's entire world. It holds water like a sponge, it opens up heavy soil, and it becomes a home for the earthworms and fungi that a hosta quietly depends on. And it does the one thing that matters most in July. Research from the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station, the oldest agricultural research station in America, found that a layer of leaf mold, just a few inches deep, keeps the soil beneath it 3 to 4 degrees Fahrenheit cooler on a hot, sunny day, and holds an extra 3 to 4 days of moisture in the ground during a dry spell. Sit with that a moment. A free pile of last year's leaves buys your hosta a cooler root zone and several more days of water, without you ever touching the hose. Here is how to lay it down. Once your hostas are up and the soil has warmed, spread 2 to 3 inches of leaf mold, shredded leaves, or well-rotted compost over the whole root zone, out to the edge of the leaves and a little beyond, because that is where the roots are reaching. But leave a clear ring of bare soil, 2 or 3 inches wide, right around the center of the plant where the leaves emerge. The crown needs to breathe. Pile wet material against it, and you trap moisture where the plant is most tender, and that is exactly how crowns rot. Cover the roots. Never bury the heart. And if you are wondering where on earth to get all this leaf mold, here is the best part. You already have it, and it costs nothing. Every autumn, the trees hand you the raw material for free. Rake the fallen leaves into a simple wire cage, or a few punctured bags tucked into a shady corner. Run the mower over them first if you want to hurry things along, dampen the pile, and then simply leave it be. A year later, you lift out dark, crumbly leaf mold, and you have manufactured the forest floor with your own 2 hands, out of the very thing most folks bag up and haul to the curb. Do just this one thing. Smother that bare, baking soil with the blanket the forest would have laid down anyway, and you will be amazed how much less watering, and how much less worrying the rest of the summer asks of you. Now, with that blanket in place, watering finally becomes simple. And this is where I can save you a great deal of wasted effort, because most gardeners water hostas exactly wrong, in 2 different ways. The first mistake is watering a little bit every single day. It feels caring. It is actually the opposite. A light daily sprinkle only ever wets the top inch of soil, so the roots learn to crowd up near the surface, chasing it. And surface roots are the first to fry in a heat wave. What a hosta truly wants instead is a long, deep soak once or twice a week, something close to an inch of water, driven down deep so the roots follow it down into the cooler, steadier ground below. Deep roots are calm roots. They find moisture the surface has already lost, and they carry the plant through the hot spells that flatten shallow-rooted plants overnight. The second mistake is where you point the hose. So many folks stand there in the evening and spray the whole plant, leaves and all, until it glistens. It looks refreshing, but wet leaves sitting through the night are an open invitation to disease, and, as you will see in just a few minutes, to something a good deal worse than disease. So water the ground, not the plant. Keep the leaves as dry as you can, and do it in the morning if you can manage it, so anything that does splash up has all day to dry off before the damp of night settles in. Deep, not daily. The soil, not the leaves. Morning, not evening. 3 small changes, not one of them costing a cent, and your hosta stops living on the knife's edge of every dry afternoon. If your hosta lives in a pot, on the patio, or beside the front step, then everything we have just said about cool roots matters twice over. Because a container is a heat trap, and almost nobody warns you about it. Think it through. Down in a garden bed, the earth itself is a fine insulator. A few inches down, the soil stays cool and steady, even on a scorching day, just like that forest floor. But a pot has none of that protection. The sides of the pot sit right out in the open, soaking up sun from morning to evening. A dark plastic or ceramic pot drinks in even more heat, and all of it passes straight through the walls and into the small ball of soil inside, until the roots themselves are sitting in a warmth they would never once feel down in the ground. The leaves can look perfectly fine while, deep inside that pot, the roots are quietly cooking. Folks see the plant sulking and reach for the watering can, when the real trouble is a root ball that is simply overheated. The good news is that the fixes are simple and free. Do not leave your pots stranded alone in the full afternoon glare. Group them together, so they shade one another's sides the way trees do in a little grove. Better still, slip your growing pot inside a larger, lighter-colored decorative one, and let that pocket of air between the two work as insulation against the heat. And in the very worst of a heat wave, just sliding the pots a few feet into brighter shade can be the whole difference between a plant that struggles and one that shrugs it off. There is one more thing worth knowing about pots. Every time you water a container, until it runs out the bottom, a little of the plant's food washes out along with it. And in July, when you might be watering that pot nearly every day, it adds up quickly. So a potted hosta does better with a very light, gentle feeding early in the season while it is actively growing, just to replace what the watering keeps rinsing away. Not to push it hard, simply to keep the little world inside that pot from running empty. It is the same lesson as always, only in miniature. Tend the soil the plant is living in, and the plant will take care of itself. Here is a truth that catches even lifelong gardeners off guard. The perfect spot for a hosta in April can quietly become the worst spot in the garden by July. And most people never go back to check. Think about what changes as the season turns. In spring, the sun sits low and soft, and the trees are only half-leafed out, so that bed by the fence gets gentle morning light and cool shade the rest of the day. Then summer arrives. The sun climbs higher and hits harder. A limb comes down in a storm, or a neighbor trims a tree, and all at once a patch that was shaded all spring is taking 3 hours of blistering afternoon sun. The hosta did not change. The light did. And that is why a hosta can look magnificent all spring and then begin to scorch the moment summer reaches its peak. So when a hosta is struggling, do not only ask how much sun it gets, ask when it gets that sun. Because one stretch of the day does nearly all the damage. From about noon until 4 in the afternoon, when the light turns fierce and the heat piles on top of it. Morning sun a hosta can take. It is gentle, and it lights those leaves up beautifully. It is that midday to 4 window that burns them. And the fix is not always to dig the plant up and move it. Often the smarter move is to build the shade the forest would have given it. Set a taller companion, a shrub, a tall perennial, an ornamental grass, just to the south or west of your hosta, positioned to catch that harsh afternoon sun before it ever reaches the leaves. You create a pool of cool, dappled light, the very woodland edge these plants evolved beneath. Instead of chasing the same summer problem year after year, you design it out of the garden for good. And if you are ever unsure whether a spot has turned too hot, do what the truly patient gardeners do. Set one potted hosta there for a single season and simply watch it, before you ever commit a real plant to that ground. That corner will tell you the honest truth about its afternoon sun faster than any book or chart ever could. Now let me tell you about something that fools almost every gardener who has ever grown a blue hosta. Because once you understand it, you will finally know why your blues keep turning green by midsummer, and you can stop blaming yourself for it. Here is the secret. A blue hosta is not actually blue. There is no blue pigment in that leaf at all. Underneath, the leaf is green, like any other. What you are seeing is a fine, powdery, waxy coating on the surface of the leaf. Gardeners call it the bloom, and that wax scatters the light in a way that makes the leaf read as that gorgeous, dusty, powder blue. It is the very same trick that makes a blueberry look blue, or a fresh plum. The color lives in the wax, not in the leaf. And here is the catch. That wax is delicate. Hot afternoon sun literally melts and wears it away. A hard blast from the hose can wash it off. And once the coating is gone, the blue is gone right along with it. The leaf underneath goes plain green, and no fertilizer, no spray, no amount of watering will bring the blue back on that leaf this year. You have to wait for a whole new flush of leaves next spring to see it again. So, if you have ever watched a beautiful blue hosta fade to green by July and wondered what on earth you did wrong, you did nothing wrong. The wax simply did what wax does in the heat. The lesson is just this. Give your blue hostas your shadiest, gentlest spots, sheltered from that afternoon sun and from overhead watering. Protect the wax, and you protect the blue. It is one of those quiet truths nobody tells you until you have already lost a whole season of color to it. That brings me to one of the most misunderstood things about hostas, and understanding it will spare you a lot of heartache and a lot of wasted effort. When a hosta leaf gets scorched, when it develops those pale bleached patches or crispy brown edges or thin papery sections where the sun cooked it, that tissue is finished. It is dead. It will not knit back together. It will not turn green again when the weather cools, and there is nothing you can pour on it or spray on it to heal it. The same goes for those lovely variegated hostas with the bright white or cream centers. That pale tissue has little or no chlorophyll to protect it, so it burns first and it burns worst. A white-centered hosta in an afternoon sun bed is a plant standing in the wrong place. Now here is the part that should actually set your mind at ease. A burned leaf looks alarming, but the plant itself is almost always just fine. The crown and the roots, the living heart of the hosta down in the soil, come through that surface damage without much trouble at all. As long as that heart stays healthy, your hosta will push out a brand new set of perfect leaves next spring, as if nothing ever happened. So let go of the burned leaf. It is not your job to save it, because you cannot. Your job is to stop the next leaf from burning. And every single thing we have talked about, cooling the soil, reading the afternoon sun, building dappled shade, is really about that one goal. Not rescuing what is already lost, but protecting what comes next. That is the whole shift, from fighting your garden to working alongside it. Now, we have already covered a great deal. The forest floor, the cooling blanket, the trick of the blue that melts. And there is more still to come, including a pair of problems that disguise themselves as each other and fool almost everyone. So before we go on, I have gathered the heart of all this onto a single page for you. It is a one-page field guide, the seasonal blanket and cooling method, the short list of what to skip, the honest year 1 to year 3 of rebuilding living soil under your hostas, and the real, named sources behind every bit of it. The kind of thing you can print out and tape inside the shed door, right where you will actually see it. Point your phone at the code on the screen, and it is yours. No charge, nothing to sign up for, no catch. Just one neighbor handing another neighbor a page worth keeping. Then stay right here with me, because the next thing I want to show you is a little creature straight out of your childhood summers, one that turns out to be among the finest slug hunters in the entire garden, working for you every single night for free. Think back for a moment to a summer evening when you were young. That first firefly blinking on in the dusk, and then a whole yard full of them, floating and glowing over the grass. Now here is something almost nobody knows about those fireflies, and it is going to change the way you look at the messy edge of your garden. A firefly spends most of its life not as that glowing adult, but as a larva, down in the soil and the leaf litter. A little creature the old folks used to call a glowworm, and that glowworm is a ferocious hunter. Its favorite prey, night after night, is the very thing that shreds your hostas. Slugs and snails. Firefly larvae are one of nature's finest slug patrols, and they live and hunt in the damp leaf litter and rich, undisturbed ground at the quiet edges of a garden. The Xerces Society, the leading voice for insect conservation in America, will tell you plainly. Those larvae hunt through the soil and the leaf litter for slugs and snails, and the ground beetles that share that same litter do the very same good work. Do you see what this means? The leaf blanket we have been talking about, the undisturbed shady corner, the ground we do not rake bare and scrape clean, that is not a mess. That is the nursery for your own free, glowing pest control crew. Every autumn, when we bag up every last leaf and scrub the garden down to naked dirt, and every time we reach for a broad spray that kills everything that moves, we are wiping out the fireflies of tomorrow and the slug hunters we so badly need. Feed the forest floor, and it does not just feed your hostas. It raises a whole army that fights the slugs for you. The very same little lights that made your childhood evenings glow. Of course, while you are rebuilding that world, The slugs are here right now, and they are hungry. So let me give you the honest short list. What actually works, and what is mostly garden folklore. Start with their hiding places, because slugs feed at night and hide by day, under boards, under pots, in thick wet debris jammed up against the plants. Lift those hideouts, thin out the crowded growth so the air can move through, and you have made your garden a far less comfortable place for them without spending a cent. Then, if you want to knock the population back quickly, do what the old-timers did. Go out about an hour after dark with a flashlight and hand-pick the slugs right off the leaves into a jar of soapy water. Do that 3 nights running, and you will be amazed how many you remove and how fast the damage slows. If you would rather set something out and walk away, the honest choice is an iron phosphate slug bait. It works well, it breaks down into the soil, and it is far safer around pets and wildlife than the older baits your father might have reached for. Just read and follow the label, as with anything. And for a hosta in a pot, a simple ring of copper tape around the rim gives the slugs a mild jolt they do not care to cross. Now the folklore. You have surely heard that a saucer of beer, or a ring of crushed eggshells, or a scattering of coffee grounds will stop slugs cold. Be honest with yourself about the results. These are hit or miss at best. A beer trap catches a few and quietly draws in a few more from the neighbor's yard. A sprinkle of eggshells is not the fortress wall the internet promised you. Save your effort for the things that truly move the needle. Their hiding spots, your flashlight, and the leaf litter that raises the creatures who hunt them for you. Now, not every mark on a hosta leaf is a slug bite, and this is where a sharp eye separates the gardener who fixes the problem from the one who fights the wrong battle for years. If you look closely at a damaged leaf and you see long, dark streaks running between the veins, brown or yellow bands, sharp and straight, boxed in by the veins as though someone drew them with a ruler, stop. That is not a slug, and it is not sunburn. That is the mark of a foliar nematode, a microscopic worm that lives inside the leaf itself and feeds in the tissue between the veins, which is exactly why the damage comes out in those clean, vein-to-vein stripes. The plant clinic at the University of Illinois points to that very pattern as the giveaway. And here is the detective trick the old hands use, and you can do it right at your kitchen table. Tear a suspect leaf into a few pieces, drop them into a shallow dish of water, and leave it for a day. Then come back with a magnifying glass and look closely at the water. If you see tiny, thread-thin worms swimming loose in it, you have your answer. Now here is the crucial part, because it ties straight back to everything we have said. These nematodes can only travel in a film of water. A wet leaf, a splash, a drop running from one leaf to the next. That is the real reason we water the soil and never the foliage. If you do find them, pull off every affected leaf and put it in the trash. Never, ever in the compost, because that simply breeds them for next year. Keep the water off the leaves from then on. And come fall, clear the plant's own spent leaves away from the crown instead of letting them mat down there over winter, because that damp, matted pile is exactly where these pests wait out the cold. Catch it early, and you can quietly shut the whole thing down. There is one hosta problem I truly hope you never meet, but you need to be able to recognize it on sight, because the wrong response spreads it, and there are a great many wrong responses floating around out there. It is called Hosta virus X, and it does not look like ordinary yellowing. It looks like ink, dark color bleeding along the veins, as if watercolor had run through the leaf, sometimes with mottled blotches, puckering, or twisted, distorted growth. It can be strangely beautiful, and that is precisely the trap. For years, infected plants were sold as exciting new varieties, and that is a big part of how it spread across the whole country. Now here is the honest truth, and I want to be very direct with you, because you will find people out there who are not. There is no cure. Dr. Ben Lockhart, the plant pathologist at the University of Minnesota who first identified this virus, studied it carefully and concluded that an infected hosta simply cannot be cured. Not with any spray, any tonic, any homemade remedy. Anyone selling you a miracle fix for a virused hosta is selling you nothing at all. The only responsible thing to do is to lift the whole plant, roots and all, and put it in the trash. Never the compost. And then, the step people skip. The virus rides from plant to plant on the sap left on your tools. So the guidance from the American Hosta Society, and this is what actually works, not the home cures, is to disinfect any blade, shovel, or pruner that touch that plant in a 10% bleach solution before it ever touches another hosta. Handle the bleach the sensible way, of course. Gloves, good airflow, and never mix it with other cleaners. And one last thing, do not plant another hosta in that same spot for about 3 years. Any other shade plant is perfectly fine there. A heuchera, a hellebore, just not another hosta. It is a hard problem, I know, but knowing it on sight, and knowing there is no shame in it and no cure for it, is how you keep one sick plant from quietly taking your whole collection. Let me clear up one more thing, because it is where a lot of good money and good intentions get poured away. When a hosta looks tired in July, the instinct is to feed it. Surely it is hungry. Surely it needs a boost. Almost always, it does not. A hosta is a light feeder. In decent soil, with some organic matter worked in over the years, it asks for very little. A tired hosta in the middle of summer is almost never a hungry hosta. It is a hot one, or a thirsty at the root one, or a sunburned one. And we have already covered exactly what to do about all three. Pouring fertilizer on a heat-stressed plant does not fix any of that. At best, it does nothing at all. At worst, it pushes out soft, tender new growth late in the season that has no time to harden off before the first frost. And that tender growth is the very first thing the cold kills. So as a simple rule, ease off feeding your hostas by the end of July and let them begin settling toward their winter rest. And this is the whole philosophy of the thing, really, sitting right there in 4 plain words. Feed the soil, not the plant. Do not chase the leaves with a bottle. Feed the ground beneath them, a top dressing of compost, that blanket of leaf mold, the slow and patient rot of the forest floor, and let the soil feed the plant the way it has, since long before any of us showed up with our bags and our sprays. The plant was never really the thing that needed tending. It was always the ground. Now I want to be straight with you about what to expect, because I am not going to promise you a miracle overnight, and anyone who does is not telling you the truth. Rebuilding a forest floor is not a one-weekend job. It is a habit that pays you back in seasons. So here is the honest timeline. In the first year, laying down that blanket of leaf mold and mulch, you will mostly notice the obvious immediate wins. The soil stays cooler and damper, you are watering noticeably less, and the plants ride through the heat with far less drama than before. That much is real, and you will feel it this very summer. By the second year, the deeper work is well underway. The worms and the fungi have been pulling that organic matter down into the ground. The soil is turning softer and spongier, and your hostas begin to bulk up. Fuller clumps, thicker leaves, richer color, because they are finally growing in something close to the home they were built for. And by the third year, you have something you cannot buy in any bag at any price. A living, self-cooling, self-watering soil that holds together through a heat wave and asks less and less of you every season. The clumps grow grander, the problems grow rarer, and the whole bed starts, quietly, to run itself. That is the honest trade. Not a quick fix, but a garden that gets easier every year instead of harder. Which, when you have been at this a good long while, is worth more than any overnight trick ever invented. I told you at the start about a hosta growing wild on a shaded slope, thriving in the same heat that wears ours down. Thriving because it never lost its forest floor. I spent more years than I would care to admit fighting that lesson. I watered on a schedule. I fed on a schedule. I fussed and sprayed and shuffled plants from corner to corner, and I could never quite understand why the woods a mile down the road grew better hostas than I did, without a single soul lifting a finger. It took me a long time to stop trying to rescue my plants, and to start, instead, giving the ground everything the forest would have given it. The day I quit gardening the hosta and began rebuilding its floor was the day my garden finally began taking care of itself. The woods were never smarter than I was. They were only more patient. They fed the soil, and they let the soil do the rest. So this July, before you reach for the hose or the bag one more time, kneel down and really look at the few inches of ground around your hostas. Because that ground, not the plant, is where the whole thing is won or lost. Lay down the blanket the forest would have laid. Cool it, cover it, and let the living soil beneath it do the work it has always known how to do. If that is the kind of patient, honest gardening that feels like home to you, the old way, the slow way, the way that leaves the ground a little better than you found it, then come along with us, subscribe, and let us keep bringing these forgotten, no-cost ways back to the garden, one season at a time.